All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Ari Berman. Ari's work has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone. He is a contributing writer for The Nation magazine. He is the author of the new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, all of which you can find at ari-berman.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Ari Berman. Ari, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me back.
All right, so Ari, I think most people who are either watching this video or listening to the show are at least somewhat aware of things like Bloody Sunday and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. At the bare minimum, they've probably at least seen Selma, right? So in addition to the events leading up to the passage of the law, your book traces what happened after its passage in 1965, which I think people are definitely less aware of. We're going to get to the backlash, but let's begin by discussing the overwhelming successes of the Voting Rights Act starting after it's passed in 1965.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that the story of what led up to the passage of the VRA has been told a lot more than what the VRA actually did. And so I wanted to talk about what happened after the passage of the act. And really, that would be what began my book, where the book would really jump off after that point. And, it was a dramatic amount of progress. I mean, first you had things like literacy tests and poll taxes eliminated, in some cases overnight, in some cases very quickly thereafter. You had federal examiners sent to the South to register African American voters in the most segregated parts of the country, places like Selma, Alabama, where African Americans hadn't been registered for decades. And so that was a transformative change to start getting people registered. Then you had federal examiners stay to the South to make sure that elections weren't stolen. And that was a huge thing because many southern states just tried to ignore the VRA, but this time they weren't able to because there was actually an enforcement mechanism and there was people on the grounds who would make sure that people were registered and these elections weren't stolen. And then over a much longer period of time, what the VRA did is it said to those states where voting discrimination had been most rampant, places like Alabama and Mississippi and all across the South, that they had to approve their voting changes with the federal government to make sure that these states complied with the law, because they knew that in the years after Reconstruction, for example, we passed the 15th Amendment and then it was ignored for nearly 95 years. And they didn't want the VRA to be ignored for decades after the passage of the law. So they had this extraordinary requirement that states had to approve their voting changes to make sure they didn't discriminate in the future. And so all of those things combined, the registration, the monitoring of elections, the submitting of voting changes, made the VRA by far the most powerful piece of civil rights legislation ever passed.
What's really interesting about the book is you go into such detail of the challenges of actually implementing it. It's like one thing, it's like the Voting Rights Act, it passed and now everybody's great. It was so not like that. I know there's one story that stuck out to me. It was in Georgia where you had this, and I believe this happened other places, where you'd have a black politician winning an election, but specifically in Georgia, the legislature just refused to let the person be sworn in. They just flat out, even after winning an election, actually getting the vote, the legislature's like, no, we're not going to let this politician in. Tell us some of the stories and challenges of implementing it.
That was Julian Bond,
who
obviously became a very famous politician, and he was famous at the time as a civil rights activist. And so the fact that they wouldn't seat such a prominent voting rights activist when they knew that this was going to get national attention, I think just showed the depths of Southern resistance. There are so many cases of resistance to the VRA. There was a place in Alabama where black candidates just were kept off the ballot. And so couldn't win election even though they had qualified to be there. So you show up on election day, you think you can vote for someone, and they're just not there. And there were dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of attempts to try to subvert the power of the growing minority vote and prevent African Americans and progressive whites from joining in a coalition together. And so telling that 5-decade story of resistance to the VRA and just showing the depth of it, and that it began the minute after the VRA passed and that it continued all the way up through today was a major story that I wanted to convey in the book.
Yeah. Well, let's get to some of the backlashes. And obviously, we've mentioned a few of these, obviously. But so right after the VRA is passed, what they do is one of the aspects is they go to try to challenge it via the Constitution.
Yeah.
Talk about that. That's actually turned around pretty quickly. But let's get to that.
It is. So, I mean, basically, days and then weeks after the VRA is passed, the southern states start trying to figure out how to challenge it. First, states like Alabama say that the federal government doesn't have the power to register new voters, and then South Carolina quickly organizes a constitutional challenge that's joined by virtually all of the southern states, and it goes directly to the Supreme Court, which is very rare. It's an incredibly long 2-day argument, one of the longest arguments in Supreme Court history, and South Carolina basically and the other southern states make the familiar argument that they made before the passage of the VRA, that the federal government doesn't have the power to enforce state voter qualifications, that states can basically do whatever they like, and things like literacy tests don't discriminate, so what's the big deal? And the Supreme Court resoundingly disagrees with that argument. They say, absolutely, the VRA is justified. It's meant to enforce the 15th Amendment, which was ignored for nearly 100 years. And it's an 8-1 decision that's announced actually on the first anniversary of Bloody Sunday. So on March 7th, 1966, a very significant day. And that means that the VRA now has some real power, that southern states realize that this law is on the books and they have to get more creative in terms of how they're going to try to thwart the VRA's power. And so that decision, South Carolina versus Katzenbach, then leads to a whole new struggle over the Voting Rights Act.
You spend a good deal of time, a solid chapter, detailing what's known as the Southern strategy. People aren't aware. Most people who are in politics kind of know what that is, but talk a little bit about that if people aren't familiar.
Well, the VRA and the civil rights laws of the 1960s did two things, two parallel trajectories. One is they enfranchised millions of new voters, and African-American voters and other minorities were able to join with progressive whites to elect more progressive candidates. So people like Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, moderate Southern whites who grew up in Jim Crow, they were able to be elected president because of the VRA. And you also had, obviously, very notable black politicians, people like John Lewis and Andrew Young, who were also elected because of the VRA. So that's the incredible part of its success story. The not so successful part of it is that as black voters in particular flocked in larger numbers to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party sensed an opportunity to court the conservative white Southern vote. And this was pivotal because this was a total reorientation of the parties on civil rights. For decades, the Republican Party, while not great on civil rights, had still been pro-civil rights by and large. People like Eisenhower, Nixon in 1960, they supported strong civil rights efforts. And what happened first in the 1964 campaign with Goldwater and then with the 1968 campaign with Nixon is that Republicans became the party that opposed the civil rights laws of the 1960s. And there were people like Strom Thurmond, the senator in South Carolina, who left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party, became very influential. The Republican Party became a lot more conservative, a lot more hostile to civil rights laws, a lot more Southern, both in ideology and in complexion. And that Southernization of the Republican Party continues today. When you look at the Tea Party, you can draw a direct line from Goldwater to the Nixon efforts to the Tea Party of today. And so I think the new voting restrictions that we're seeing now, which in many cases happened after so many of these state legislatures flipped from red to blue after the descendants of the Tea Party, can be traced back to a 40 and 50-year effort to try to change the makeup of the Republican Party when it came to civil rights.